thought about like how the Bible, I mean, specifically the New Testament, how it came to be?
Yeah, it's kind of taken for granted, isn't it? Like it's just always been there.
Right, like this ancient book. But um, we're actually going on a deep dive today into, well, the history of the New Testament texts. And we're going to use Bart Ehrman's book, Misquoting Jesus, to kind of guide us along the way. And I think what might be surprising to you, our listener, is that the scriptures that we have today didn't really just appear. It wasn't like this straightforward,
Yeah.
error-free process.
Yeah, and right from the get-go,
Mhm.
Ehrman's main point is super interesting. He argues that those New Testament manuscripts we have, they're not just perfect copies of some long-lost original. I mean, think about it, right?
Yeah.
They were copied by hand.
By scribes, yeah.
Exactly, scribes. And so there are variations, some small, but sometimes, well, kind of significant. And that really makes you think about the human element involved in all of this, like how those humans who were copying, how they might have shaped the very words that we read today.
Right. And it's not just some kind of, academic point. Ehrman's own journey is a great example. He started out totally believing that the Bible was perfect. Every word was divinely inspired, transmitted perfectly through time. But it was when he really got into the study of these ancient texts, that's what made him start to question, like that absolute certainty. So you can really see how it's this personal quest for him to understand the history of these writings that has been so influential.
Yeah, and that personal element I think is so crucial here because Ehrman wasn't, out to like destroy faith. He was driven by really a desire for accuracy, like historical accuracy. And that led him to this whole field called textual criticism. So think of it, for you, the listener, like a detective, but literary detective. They're trying to reconstruct the original form of a text. But it exists in all these different versions, slightly different versions. So they're trying to go through all the clues, those little variations in the ancient copies to get as close as possible to what the original authors may have written. And for this, Ehrman, he had to learn Greek, other ancient languages. Wow, so really committing to it. Oh yeah, committed to uncovering this story.
Okay, so left jump in, really dig in here. Ehrman argues that Christianity, early Christianity, a lot like Judaism where it came from, was what he calls a bookish religion. Now, that might seem kind of obvious to us now, right? We're surrounded by books and screens and whatever, but you got to picture the Roman Empire, the wider Roman Empire at that time. Their culture wasn't really centered on the written word in the same way.
Yeah, and if you think about the bigger picture here, Jesus himself was a Jewish rabbi. So, super knowledgeable about Jewish scriptures, teaching from them, what we call the Old Testament. That was his authority on God's will.
Yeah.
And his earliest followers, they were also Jewish. So they just naturally continued this deep respect for sacred writings. So from its very beginnings, this Christian movement, it stood out, like they relied on written texts to define their core beliefs, their practices.
And it wasn't just limited to the Jewish scriptures either, right? There was this huge amount of Christian writing really, really early on. Way more than the 27 books we think of as the New Testament. So we're talking, Matthew, Mark, Luke, John, those Gospels. But there were others, like Gospels attributed to Philip, to Thomas, to Mary Magdalene. Even Luke, in his own Gospel, he hints that there were other accounts floating around.
Yeah, and it's the sheer volume, right? It's just
Yeah.
like, whoa, there was so much. We have these other Gospels, but then there were accounts of what the apostles did.
Right.
Right? So like Acts of Paul, Acts of Peter, Acts of Thomas, all sorts of these. And then on top of that, letters. Like tons of letters, epistles going around these early church communities. And we can't forget the apocalypses, like, visions of the end times.
Yeah.
Not just Revelation, but the apocalypse of Peter, the shepherd of Hermas. I mean, that was a big deal in some early Christian circles.
So with all these different writings going around, flying around everywhere, you have to wonder, like, how did we end up with this specific collection we now call the New Testament? It's not like it just poof, appeared,
Yeah, it's a process. And the idea of a fixed collection, what we call the Canon, that develops, gradually over time.
So how did some books become so important, so authoritative, while others just kind of faded away?
Well, one of the earliest guys we know of who really wrestled with this, his name was Marcion, and this is in the mid-2nd century. And get this, he actually proposed the very first defined Christian canon, like this is what's in, this is what's out. And it was pretty radical, let me tell you. Included a version of Luke, 10 of Paul's letters, but, and here's the kicker, it totally rejected the Old Testament.
Whoa, like the whole thing.
The whole thing.
Why would he do that?
Well, it all came down to his theology, like how he understood God. He saw this big conflict between the God of the Old Testament, like the strict creator, all about the law, and the God revealed through Jesus in the New Testament, the God of love, the God of grace. So he's like, these are totally different. And that's why he just chucked the whole Old Testament out of his canon.
Wow, bold move. So how did people react to that?
Oh, huge reaction. I mean, figures like Irenaeus, who was the Bishop of Lyons, they were totally against Marcion's ideas.
Hmm.
They argued passionately for accepting 4 specific Gospels, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. Irenaeus, he even came up with these symbolic associations for each. Matthew was the human aspect of Jesus, Mark was the lion, symbolizing royalty, Luke was the ox representing sacrifice and service, and John was the eagle, signifying the divine, the spiritual. And while the exact symbolism might have changed a bit over time, Irenaeus really pushing for those 4 Gospels, that was a huge turning point.
So those 4 become like the foundation, even today. But even after these early attempts to kind of pin down, like, what's in and what's out, what's scripture, it wasn't really over, was it?
Oh, not all.
Other Christian writings, they were still being read, shared, considered authoritative. Different regions, different communities, they had their favorites for a long time. So the whole idea of what was scripture was still kind of, I don't know, fluid in a way.
Yeah, and something that really strikes me when we think about this early period is how they actually experienced these texts. Like us, today, we're so used to reading on our own, but back then it was completely different.
You have to go to the library.
Well, yeah, if there even was a library. But the bigger point is most people couldn't even read. Like, think about it. You, the listener, imagine yourself back then. The vast majority of people across the board, even early Christians, many of them came from, less educated backgrounds, they were illiterate. So how did the message spread?
Word about.
Well, yeah, but also public reading. In the Christian communities, they'd read these texts out loud, Gospels, letters, everything, in gatherings, especially during worship. So for most early Christians listening, that was the main way they encountered these writings, the way they learned about their faith. So the person reading, they had a lot of power in shaping how the community understood everything.
That makes a lot of sense. So then the people who were copying and reading those texts, the scribes, they become really important, right?
Oh, incredibly important. And that's where things get super interesting in terms of how these texts actually changed over time.
Okay, so fill us in. What happened with the scribes?
Well, Ehrman points out that early on, those scribes, most of them were amateurs.
Really?
Oh, yeah. Not professionally trained in this super meticulous art of copying manuscripts. I mean, think about it. They weren't like scholars in some fancy scriptorium.
You didn't have a scriptorium.
Probably not. Often, they were just literate Christians in their community copying in their spare time.
Just trying to help out.
Exactly. But that meant unintentional errors were pretty likely, misspelling a word, skipping a line, repeating a phrase, like when you're copying notes from a friend and you miss something or you hear it wrong.
Yeah, I get that.
But it gets even more interesting because it wasn't just accidental stuff. Different theological ideas, different interpretations were popping up all over in the early Christian movement. And some scribes, well, they made changes to the text on purpose.
Fit their agenda.
In a way, yeah. So both the accidents and those deliberate changes, well, they had a real impact on what was passed down.
We can actually see those changes in some of the oldest manuscripts we have today, like Codex Vaticanus. It's from the 4th century. And in Hebrews 1:3, the original scribe, they wrote that Christ manifests everything by his word, his power. But a later scribe came along and they were like, that doesn't sound quite right. So they changed it to bears, like Christ bears, all things, that's more common.
Yeah.
But then, get this, another scribe noticed that change and they corrected it back to manifests, even adding a note in the margin, like criticizing the second scribe for changing the old reading.
It's like a little scholarly battle frozen in time in this ancient book. It's amazing.
So we can literally see them arguing in the margins.
Pretty much. And then there are whole sections that were added that most scholars agree weren't originally there. Like the story of the woman caught in adultery in John 7:53 to 8:11, and that longer ending of Mark 16:9 to 20.
Yeah, those are famous stories.
Right. But the evidence is pretty clear that they were added later.
So what's the evidence for that?
Well, they're just not in some of the earliest and best manuscripts we have. The writing style is kind of different. And in Mark's ending, the transition from the verses before it just feels really sudden. Theories are maybe they were part of oral tradition, or maybe they were in different later manuscript traditions. And then over time, they got stuck into the main text.
And Ehrman also mentions that with the adulterous woman's story, it was added in different places by different scribes. Like it was just floating around independently, and people were like, oh, let's add that in here.
Exactly. And sometimes you can tell that changes were made to address specific concerns, like how the early Christians were viewed by others. There's a part in Mark 6:3, where in some manuscripts, Jesus is called a carpenter, but in others, he's the son of a carpenter.
What's the difference, really?
Well, it might be that son of a carpenter was a way to kind of push back against people looking down on Jesus because of his social status, like connecting him to the trade but not actually saying he was the laborer.
A bit more respectable.
Exactly. And there's that part in Luke 23:32, where it's a little unclear who the criminals crucified with Jesus were. Some scribes made it super clear that only the two others were criminals, maybe to really hammer home Jesus' innocence.
It's like they're making these changes, maybe small changes, to kind of, make the story fit better with how they're trying to present it.
Exactly. Reflecting the needs and concerns of the Christian communities as they interacted with the world around them. But there were also those big theological changes, the ones meant to reinforce certain beliefs and counter what they saw as like heretical ideas.
Yeah, like the whole debate about who Jesus was.
Exactly. The early centuries of Christianity, that was like a theological battleground, especially about the nature of Jesus.
Yeah, fully God, fully man, all that.
Right. And you had some groups, they were called adoptionists, and they believed that Jesus was just a man, born a regular man, and then God adopted him as his son at his baptism because he was so righteous.
Oh, interesting. So, like, he earned it.
Yeah, that was their idea.
But other people disagreed, right?
Oh, big time.
Yeah.
Scribes, who believed that Jesus was always divine, they would change the texts to emphasize Jesus' existence before he was born, his virgin birth, that he was inherently divine from the very start.
So they're trying to squash that adoptionist view.
Exactly. Trying to, make it really clear that Jesus was always God. And actually, we don't see a ton of changes promoting the adoptionist view in the manuscripts we have.
Why not? You'd think it would be more of a back and forth.
Well, it's probably because as those more mainstream, what they called orthodox views about Jesus' divinity became the dominant view, later scribes were more likely to correct any passages that might sound like they supported adoptionism.
So we're mostly seeing the winner's version.
Yeah, in a way.
Interesting. Okay, so what other kinds of theological changes were there?
Well, another big one had to do with how they understood Jesus' death. Like, what did it mean for salvation? In Mark, Jesus really suffers on the cross. He even cries out, my God, why have you forsaken me? But Luke's gospel, it's a bit different. Jesus seems more in control. And he even comforts one of the criminals next to him, saying, today you will be with me in paradise.
That's a big difference. So why the change?
It probably reflects Luke's own theology. Like in Acts, which he also wrote, when the apostles are preaching, they don't always focus on Jesus' death as like this atoning sacrifice like Mark and Paul do. For Luke, it seems more like Jesus' death is this turning point that leads people to realize they need to repent and receive God's forgiveness.
So it's more about the change it causes in people.
Exactly. So when Luke edits Mark's account, he's probably highlighting that different idea of salvation and maybe even showing like a model for how persecuted Christians should face death, with faith and assurance.
Yeah, so they can look to Jesus and be like, okay, he went through this, I can go through this too.
Right. And then you have those changes that reflect the growing tension between early Christianity and Judaism. Like in some later manuscripts of Luke, they actually remove Jesus' prayer for forgiveness on the cross. Father, forgive them, for they do not know what they are doing.
That's in Luke 23:34, right?
That's the one. And when you think about the historical context, it's really significant because early church fathers, almost all of them, they thought that prayer was specifically for the Jewish people.
Oh, wow.
Right. So as things got worse between Christians and Jews in the later centuries, it's totally possible that some scribes, reflecting that anti-Jewish feeling, they just took the prayer out.
So the text is changing along with the social and political climate.
Yeah, a stark example of that for sure.
It's kind of sad in a way. Okay, so were there other types of changes based on, social stuff going on?
Yeah, Ehrman talks about changes related to women's roles in the early church. Like in Paul's letter to the Romans, there are women in leadership. Phoebe's called a deacon. Junia is recognized as foremost among the apostles. But later on, some manuscripts of 1 Corinthians, they added verses saying women should be silent in church.
Oh, wow. So it's like they're trying to silence the women.
In a way, yeah. Most scholars think those verses in Corinthians, they were added later, maybe originally a note in the margin, and then it got incorporated into the text. And it was probably trying to push for a more patriarchal view of church leadership as things got more organized, more structured.
So power dynamics changing, and then the text changes to kind of support that.
Exactly. And then there's Junia in Romans 16:7. That's a woman's name. But in some later interpretations, they changed it to Junius, a male name, even though there's no evidence that Junius was even a common male name back then.
They just wanted it to be a man?
Pretty much. And these changes, they highlight that ongoing debate about women's roles and how interpretations and even the texts themselves, they could be shaped to support certain views.
Okay, so we've got all these different manuscripts. They're being copied, changed, sometimes accidentally, sometimes on purpose. So how did we get to the New Testament we have today?
That's where we get to those incredible discoveries of ancient manuscripts and the rise of, textual scholarship, the people really studying all of this.
Like the manuscript detectives.
Exactly.
So who are the big names? Who should we know about?
Well, Desiderius Erasmus in the early 16th century, he's a big one. He produced the first printed edition of the Greek New Testament, the Editio Princeps, scholars call it, like the first time it was ever printed.
Wow.
Right. But it was kind of rushed, and he only used a few manuscripts, and they were relatively late manuscripts. And get this, for the last 6 verses of Revelation, he didn't even have a Greek manuscript.
What did he do?
He translated the Latin Vulgate, which was the standard Latin translation, back into Greek.
So he just made it up?
Well, he created a Greek version that didn't exist in any of the manuscripts he had.
Mm.
But even with all that, his edition became super influential. Like, it was the basis for the King James Bible.
So that's the version that we've inherited, really.
In a way, yeah. And then there's Richard Bentley, early 18th century. He was all about those older manuscripts like Codex Alexandrinus, and he wanted to compare them with early Latin versions. And Johann Jakob Wettstein, he started looking at traditional theological interpretations in light of all the variations he was finding in different manuscripts. Like, wait a minute, what if this actually means something different?
So really digging deep and challenging assumptions.
Exactly. And then the 19th century, that's when some really dramatic discoveries happened.
What happened in the 1800s?
Well, Constantine von Tischendorf, he found Codex Sinaiticus at the monastery of St. Catherine at Mount Sinai.
Oh, I've heard of that one.
Right. And the story of how he got it is legendary. Multiple trips, some serious negotiation. But it ended up being one of the oldest and most complete New Testament manuscripts we have.
Wow.
I know, right? And then you have Brooke Foss Westcott and Fenton John Anthony Hort, late 19th century. Their work was truly groundbreaking.
What did they do?
Well, they created this critical edition of the Greek New Testament. And they developed all these principles for evaluating manuscripts, based on what kinds of errors they shared. That was huge. It basically laid the scientific foundation for how we study the New Testament today. Like how scholars try to figure out the earliest possible text.
So they're like the forefathers of the manuscript detectives.
You could say that.
It's also important to remember, right, that the gospel writers themselves, they weren't just passively recording what happened. Matthew and Luke, they used Mark's gospel as a source, but they made choices. They selected, they omitted, they changed stuff, all to emphasize their own points of view, the messages they wanted to get across.
Totally. Like Ehrman points out that Matthew and Luke, they both consistently softened Mark's portrayal of Jesus getting angry.
Oh, really?
Yeah, where Mark might describe Jesus as indignant or outright angry, Matthew and Luke, they'll either make it about compassion or just take it out completely.
So they're changing the tone, making him seem more, I don't know, gentle, maybe?
Yeah, something like that. And it shows that interpretation, that adaptation, it was already happening from the very beginning, even with the written Gospels.
So it wasn't just the scribes later on, but the gospel writers themselves.
Exactly.
So to wrap up this deep dive, the big takeaway for you, the listener, is that those New Testament texts that we read today, they're not like perfect, unchanging replicas.
Right.
They came to us through this long and complicated history, copying, interpreting, and sometimes people change things on purpose.
Like a human story.
Yeah, a very human story. And understanding that history, it can really change how you see the Bible. Not that it becomes less important, but you see it with a whole new depth.
It adds that historical layer.
Exactly.
And, here's something to think about. If the actual words have changed over time, what does that mean for the idea of divine inspiration? Like, is there one single original message?
That's a big question.
It is. It's something to really think about,
Thanks for joining us on this deep dive.
Yeah, we hope you found it illuminating. And we look forward to, exploring more of these kinds of topics with you in the future.